G'day there, ladies and gents. Mark Wallace here from Econisis. Hope you're all doing well. It is September 2023, and today I wanted to do a video that on a topic that I was alluding to in my last video, which is talking a little bit about intergenerational inequality, and particularly wealth inequality. So this is a little bit different to income inequality, which is related to this, but it tends to deal with issues of socioeconomic differences in socioeconomic status, as well as differences between Indigenous First Nations as well as non-Indigenous incomes and household earnings, and those are major issues. But in this particular topic, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the significant inequalities that we see from an intergenerational perspective in terms of wealth. One of the things we'll notice in this is I do talk about house prices a lot, and that's because median house prices and housing generally is a major source of wealth in this country and has been a major source of wealth. And so as a result of that, you end up in a situation where sometimes housing gets used as a bit of a proxy for that of household wealth. But a lot of the times it's not the wealth, it's housing itself. It's actually the policies around that and some of the differences we've seen from the baby boomer generation, and particularly that with the millennials and Gen Z, and how that's flown through to those differences have flown through to the capacity of each generation to generate wealth and to have a level of personal household economic sustainability. One of the things criticisms I often get raised when I raise this topic, or get asked or told when I raise this topic, is that, the baby boomer generation, they're older, so they've had more time to generate wealth, and so a direct comparison one-to-one isn't fair. And that's absolutely true. You would not expect a generation that is younger to have its share of wealth to the same degree as an older generation because of that age and the benefits of just time accumulation and compounding interest benefiting a household. However, you would expect to see something comparable when the different generations were at the same age. And what we can see when we look at housing prices or housing ownership, in the early 30s, or say by the time a person is 35, we see some drastic differences between a baby boomer generation that where 65% of people owned their own home by the time they were 35 versus 58% or 55 to 58% for Generation X, and less than 50% and close to 40% in some cases for millennials. And so in that instance alone, you're already starting to see at the same age, at different people's lifestyles, you're seeing very different flow-through effects in terms of the foundation of their wealth. And of course, the earlier you start to gain access to wealth generating tools like owning a home, the more you have that tool to then generate wealth in the long term. If you enter those wealth generating tools later because of constraints, and we talked about that last time about first home buyers, that has a multi-year, multi-decade implication in terms of how much wealth you can generate. So that's the first thing to understand, is the fact that since 1981 to 2021, incomes increased by 5.9 times and housing increased by 10.3 times. And so in real housing purchasing affordability terms, the people who are in the housing market now, so that's the younger millennials for entering the market through to Gen Z, that cohort there is very much unable to enter the housing market because their incomes have not grown at the same rate as that of the baby boomers. At the same time, the majority of baby boomers were in the housing market at the time in which that disconnect and decoupling of housing prices with purchasing power started to occur, and so have been able to benefit from the increase in housing prices and have not been as significantly impacted by the slower growth in household income. The result of this is that we now have a situation where almost 2/3 of all housing stock in this country is owned by one generation, that being the baby boomers, despite them representing between 18 and 21% of the population, depending on how you define it. You compare that to the millennials, who have less than 7% of all housing wealth, and obviously Gen Z, which is less than 2% of housing wealth. So those two generations alone together have less than a sixth of the level of home ownership of what the baby boomer generation does, despite both generations being larger in size than the baby boomers. So that's a significant issue. The other criticism I often hear is about this commentary is that, I'm a baby boomer, I earned this wealth, I earned my wealth. And unfortunately, the statistics don't show that. In fact, the baby boomers have the least earned their wealth of any generation in human history. They had the highest level of social welfare dependence and government receipts of any generation in Australian history. They have received more free services from government than any generation in human history, education and health being the most relevant there. They've also received the most tax support of any generation in human history, particularly in the form of negative gearing, and a very, very favorable negative gearing benefits that are associated with that. And they've, despite having not spent their entire lives benefiting from compulsory superannuation, they did, however, have that money as disposable income, because obviously, this is not a tax, superannuation isn't a tax on business, it's actually taken from people's wages and their future wage growth, and so therefore it is actually money that they had in their hand, when now it's actually been intentionally siphoned off and put aside for later generations to be able to use for their retirement. So even with that, they've still benefited from that by having the cash in hand, and then benefited from the second half of their careers with the compulsory superannuation. So we're now in a situation of where the average millennial in 2021 had a net household worth of, this is everybody up to the age of between 26 and 41, had an average household worth of around $330,000, where average baby boomer had a wealth that sits between $1.3 and $1.6 million per household, depending on whether they are younger boomers and older boomers. Interestingly enough, there's a similar split between Gen X and Gen Y, with younger Gen X more likely to be in line with millennials with significantly depressed median household wealth, while older Gen Xers are more likely to have wealth comparable to that of younger boomers. And so that's actually where the inequality split exists. It exists in the middle of the Gen X generation, and that's actually where we see this dichotomy. Now, what does this mean? This basically has created a situation where now not only are younger generations unable to generate wealth at the same degree as the baby boomers, because that rate is firstly just inherently unsustainable and was never sustainable to begin with, but also they've taken the wealth devices that the younger generations need in order to build their own wealth, and that is in the form of home ownership. We've also seen this really perverse and almost sociopathic approach to housing ownership, of where the hoarding of housing by the baby boomer generation has forced young people into renting, which they've then used to gouge younger people for renting by increasing rents at a faster rate than that of house prices, of incomes. So we're in this situation of not only have the older generations had more time to generate wealth, which is fine, they've benefited disproportionately from increasingly non-existent and constrained tax benefits and welfare. They've produced less than any other generation. They've generated less productive wealth than any generation, yet have up to 5 times more wealth than what they actually should be. Now, this is likely to come to something of a reckoning in the next little while, because what we're going to see is a significant transfer of wealth between generations as baby boomers die. But what we're also seeing is life expectancy is increasing. So where you would see that natural flow of wealth back into younger generations through that process, we're seeing baby boomers not dying off as quick. And so as a result of that, that wealth isn't being transferred, and instead is being locked up and hoarded by older people, and therefore it's having pretty significant and in some cases disastrous consequences for the structure of the economy. So what do we need to do? We basically need to figure out a way to strip every baby boomer, on average, of about 65% of their wealth, and redistribute that across the economy. And we need to do that before they enter retirement or as they are in retirement, because one of the things we need to make sure is that the vast majority of baby boomers who have all that wealth are still taking a pension of some sort, which is just unbelievable. But it is that welfare-dependent, productivity, laziness generation that has become synonymous with the baby boomers throughout their entire productive lives. And so we need to figure out a way to strip as much of that wealth out of baby boomers into other generations and give it to other generations as possible, since they're not dying as quickly as we need them to. Now, obviously, you could take a very morbid approach and say you just need them to die quicker, and yes, in some cases that would actually solve the problem. But if you can't do that, you need to figure out tax ways to do it. And so there's some easy things to do, and that would be to limit the availability of tax incentives for rental properties for older generations, or for any generation really, but particularly for older generations, and starting to force the divestment of housing by older generations as they move forward. Not necessarily the family home, but all of the other investment properties that they own, since they own about 80% of investment properties in this country sit within older Gen X through to baby boomers. So we need them to divest as much of that property as possible. Potentially up to 2/3, if not more, of that housing needs to be stripped away from baby boomers, and then moved back into the housing market to start pushing down housing prices and improving housing affordability going forward in the future. So we need to be recycling existing stock and helping to address housing supply. And the easiest way to do that is either remove all tax incentives and benefits from housing that's associated with as like the second investment property onwards, and so there is no capital gains benefit, there's no tax benefits associated with negative gearing and depreciation, or better still, completely completely isolate the tax benefits associated with those properties only for the income of those properties and not transfer it back over to the main income of the household, and therefore eliminate the benefits of negative gearing. And we already do that in our tax system through personal income, personal income, where any losses are entirely isolated to losses to that income and not to other sources of income. That alone would have a significant impact in disincentivizing the hoarding of wealth and the almost psychopathic hoarding of wealth that we're seeing in the baby boomer generation as they have aged and moved through the system. We also need to look at ways in which for the family home we need to, as it's disposed of, capping removing some of the incentives that are there with regard to the allowance for no capital gains. That should only apply up to a certain value, particularly linked to the purchase price of the property. And so if the property was purchased for 300,000 and it's now worth 2 million, you can say that you can have an allowance of up to 900,000 tax-free, and everything above that is taxed at 50% in normal capital gains approach, because that is not gains that can be attributed to the productive contribution that those households have made. It's a housing bubble that has been a result of the hoarding of those assets. So that's another way you could do it, because every time a baby boomer has to sell their house, then, because eventually they all have to sell their house, you can pull out at least 400 grand's worth of tax from that household that they didn't actually ever earn from their productive contributions to the economy, and be able to move that back into other generations in terms of new housing, land, transport infrastructure, services and facilities that the baby boomers all got for free, but everybody else has had to pay for. And so some of these incentives are things we're going to see. You're also going to have the potential for things like death taxes. And I think this is going to be a really, really big topic going forward into the future, is like how do you as a society strip as much of the wealth out of baby boomers when they die, not just for the household that it's going to, the kids that it's going to, but then also through to the wider society. And so having death taxes on transfer on assets over certain values or on estates over certain values are going to be a really important tool to start to equalize a lot of these types of facilities. But to put it in context, when the research that's been done in the past suggests that there's about $3 trillion worth of baby boomer wealth that needs to be removed from baby boomers and redistributed in order to ensure that the very fundamental sustainability of the system that we have remains. The problem is that the baby boomers don't want that. They're hoarding their wealth in that sociopathic type way I mentioned previously, and they don't want any changes to happen until after they're dead. And they, unlike previous generations, fundamentally at a whole of generational level, don't care what happens after they die, which is a really strange thing that we've never seen before. Is all the surveys have shown is that if something happens after in the future, baby boomers don't care. They don't have that connection with their children and leaving the legacy as previous generations have had. They only care about what's happening now. And so the cost of doing this has to be incurred now, not in the future, in order for it to have real impacts. So that's where we're going to leave it today. A lot of controversial topics here, but I think it's a really important one because it's at the core of the issues we're facing as a country from an economic perspective now and into the future. But that's it for today, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much. Have a great one. Talk to you soon.